Hello, Silas here, and I'm here with Steven. You can say what's up.
Hello, everyone.
I'm trying to find a different way or a way to get these exciting enough to get you here. Well, thank you for being here. We're here for conversation, and we're going to be talking about the book, Why We Believe in Gods. And tell us a bit about this book, Steven.
Sure. So this book is written by a J. Anderson Thomson and a Clare Aukofer. Again, debating on
Alcofer.
how to
Alcofer.
Aukofer. Yep. This was done for Richard Dawkins. So this book explores the origins of religious belief from both it's an anthropological, evolutionary psychology, and also even a neuroscientific standpoint. It walks through the various steps point by point as why do people embrace religious beliefs and hold on to them throughout their lives based on all these various disciplines and the factors that lead up to this.
Yeah. And it's a really interesting thing. Stephen read this book. It's about 100 pages, about a booklet. If you remember, there's a skit in Curb Your Enthusiasm where George Alexander, Jason Alexander, who plays George on the Seinfeld, in the Curb Your Enthusiasm, he's actually playing himself as most of the people do, and he has this book release, and then Larry David kind of goes to the book release. It's like, it's kind of small, more of a booklet, wouldn't you say? But it's been interesting so far. Stephen read it, and he's been walking me through, and some of our conversations go like this. Sometimes we both have read the content and we just kind of have a conversation. Sometimes it's an article that we're going through together, like the fortification of the election. And some of the times it's like this, where one of us has read something and we take notes and we actually have a conversation based on that. And for me, I've been very interested in this. And at the same time, I've been re-listening to some audiobooks going through, and there's a lot of correlation with this because it's talking about the evolution and how we came to be. So there's some Evo psych type of things like this, but focused particularly on our beliefs in gods. So this is from the earliest gods, the earliest written gods in the times of Sumeria and things like that, which I also found out was the first time that we had a discovery of written down concept of zero that was being used, because I used to think that was initially found first in South American places, but no, that was actually in the Sumerian first. But then the Sumerians didn't pass it around; that was lost for some time. But anyway, there. But from there to today and to the gods we're going to invent in the future, this kind of shows what's behind that. And the audiobook I was listening when we started this conversation was The Moral Animal by Robert Wright, and that's also about evolutionary psychology. So that's about morality and things like that. Just coming out, and they touched on religion a bit in there, but that was showing how there's genetic reasons, there's just biological reasons for why we can actually develop something like morality. And then right now, I'm re-listening to The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, who is also one of the co-authors of this book, and is one of his seminal works. I think it was one of his earliest works, if not the first one. I think he wrote one before that or something. But it was one of his biggest works back in '73. And he's also talking about the selfish gene, and he's talking about some things about we were having a short conversation before this. Are people really looking for authenticity? Are people really looking for truth? What does the belief in God really fit in? Are they trying to find an accurate answer for certain things that they're aware of that they don't understand? Or do they just want something that fits enough that they can say, okay, we know that the weather exists, but we don't know how to actually, there's so much about it that we don't understand, but we know it has such a massive effect on our life. So if we can put the concept of Zeus controlling it, and if we do these few actions that might have some effect on it, even if it's not negligible, if it's not something that's constant, but it makes us more comfortable to go along. Do they really care about barometric pressure, about cloud formations, about cirrus and stratocumulus and things like that? Do they really care about that, or is it just enough for them to know that that is something accounted for by this belief, to have some kind of faith? And there'll be a separate video with beliefs, with the different things of different definitions of things like belief, faith, gods that we're going to be using in these conversations. But I think there is a significant difference between belief and faith. For me, a belief is not something that you choose necessarily. It's something that you kind of just fall into. You get enough data and enough information, and then you start believing something. Like, you meet a girl, you start talking to the girl, you're a woman, she's smiles at you, she looks at you a certain way, and then you're like, okay, I believe that I like that person. And that's something that you just feel in yourself, like, I like that person. And then you find out that she hits kids, or she has like student debt, or she's super rad femme, like trans exclusionist rad femme, and you're a positive, you're a trans inclusionist feminist, and then you're like, okay, all of a sudden that happens, and then that belief that you had that you like this person, some new data comes in, and then you automatically stop believing that person. That person that you liked before, that you believed you liked, was the exact same person before you got that information that changed that from a belief of liking somebody to possibly a belief of hating this somebody or actively being against this person. And I don't think that is a necessary decision that you make. It's just certain things come to you. Now, faith, I think that's separate, and that comes to the religion. And the most accurate definition for faith that I've found, especially when you're talking about religious things, is from Matt Dillahunty, where he says faith is the excuse you give when you don't have any actual reasons. Because if somebody says, okay, I believe I like that person, you'll say, why do you like that person? And you'll have certain things you will be able to think of. Then when you stop, you'll probably also have other things to think, okay, this is probably the thing that made me stop. But if it's somebody you've never met, it's like, oh, I have faith if I meet, what is it, somebody's real, Anya Taylor-Joy, if I just meet her, we're just going to madly fall in love. I know nothing about Anya Taylor-Joy besides she looks like the hottest, kind of most attractive alien ever with her neoteny and features. And she's a super talented actress. So that's already enough. But that would be more of like a faith, because there's nothing to actually base it on besides this weird kind of attraction, the stalker type of thing. It's not really based on anything. So I think those are the kind of two different things between belief and faith. But yeah, any thoughts on the core definitions about where we're going to be going in?
I mean, I think that's good for now. Like we said, we can do a clip where we just talk about those specifically, and then delve more in depth into those things.
Okay.
I think I'm. Anything else, or?
Yeah, one last thing.
Sure.
Bear with me. Thank you all for listening.
Go.
I think part of why I think this is important is because I also personally don't believe, especially when it comes to something like beliefs in gods, those are actually personal beliefs. There's different kind of ways to have different things that are beliefs. I think some things might be personal, but if something is truly personal and you don't really act on it, then it has really no effect. But when you believe in a creator of existence, as most people do believe in gods or things that actually have effects on not just you, but other people in the world, it is going to affect how you interact with people, what you expect from people. Like a simple example is, I believe Dr. Seuss books helped me become the person that I am today. So it's like, oh, I like Dr. Seuss books. And I just say that, but I never buy a Dr. Seuss book. I never plan on reading one. I never ask anyone to get me on anything. It's just a belief I have. Okay, that's a personal belief. Now, if I'm trying to marry somebody or I'm trying to parent somebody, I've had somebody's kid, then I'm like, okay, I need this person to also believe this because we're going to read Dr. Seuss books to our kids. Now that becomes something that is social. It's more towards the people. Now imagine me becoming the head of a school board, of being a minister of education in some place, and then I say, okay, now I'm going to demand that all kids have to read only Dr. Seuss because that's going to make them a thing. Because I think Dr. Seuss is the definer. It's the main thing that made me who I am. So that's why you can take something that is just a basic personal belief, and depending on how you interact with it, if it's just me and my wife or me and the mother of my future children and whatnot, we can have a conversation and discuss that, and that's two people willingly. But then certain beliefs do get to a certain point where, depending on the belief and the power of the person, it's going to have an effect on other people who are not involved in having a conversation or discussion or choice about their interaction with that person's personal belief. So I think that's why it's important to understand why people believe in God. So even if you personally don't believe in any particular God, it will help you understand why our ancestors did, why you might have in the past, why you might in the future, and why people around you do. So I think that's part of why I'm glad that Stephen decided to bring this book to my attention and take the time to read it and come here and have this conversation with us. And thank you all for being here. So yeah, we're on chapter 9.
I was just going to jump right into chapter 9.
Okay, so we're on chapter 9. We've done chapter 1 through 9 through 8 so far. I think chapter 1 to 5 will be one part, and then 6 and 7 will be another part separate, and then 8 will be one separate. And I think today we'll be able to get 9 and 10 together from what Stephen is, what we've seen from just the general way we have these conversations. But yeah, let's jump into it.
Sure. So chapter 9, O ye of little faith, discovering the physical evidence of God as byproduct. Darwin says, how paramount the future is to present when one is surrounded by children. While the word byproduct sounds trivial, it's actually important. Reading and writing emerge as cultural byproducts of adaptations designed for other purposes. We don't have reading and writing modules in the brain, but we do have vision, a spoken language, symbolic thought, and fine motor movement of our hands combined with other adaptations. Similar story with music. Lone Frank, the Danish neurobiologist and journalist, has said the sacred is between the ears, quote unquote, and the latest neuroscience and imaging proves it. Perhaps the most famous of this brain research as far as religion has been, it was done by Michael Persinger, a psychologist at Laurentian University in Canada. Since the 1980s, he has experimented with what's known as the God helmet. People are placed in a dark and quiet room. Sight and sound perception are blocked, and a helmet that magnetically stimulates the temporal lobes is placed over the head. Test subjects report the presence of another. Depending on the person's personal and cultural history, their sense presence might be interpreted by the helmeted subject to be supernatural religious figure, or a supernatural religious figure. Women reported these experiences more than men. And Aaron Ra has that discussion on Myth Vision where he talked about how people will see images of gods that they worshipped or are familiar with. So, for example, like a Christian will see the image of Jesus in something, but a Hindu will not. But then a Hindu will see Shiva or something in something, but they wouldn't see Jesus. So that is sort of reflective of that. Persinger says this isn't caused by a single part of the brain or a single sense of self. There are several areas of the brain from which it emanates. In our usual state, the left side of the brain, which controls language, dominates. In other settings, such as those marked by fear, depression, personal crisis, low oxygen, low blood sugar, or wearing the God helmet, the right side is stimulated, and that additional sense of self intrudes into the consciousness, and it feels like another. This stimulation of the religious experiences via the temporal lobes is not just an academic oddity or artifact of magnets in a lab. The temporal lobes are especially important for speech, and a common element of religious experiences is hearing the voice of a god. One can misattribute our internal voice to an outsider's voice. It's been documented for some time that these individuals with temporal lobe epilepsy, which comes from electrical disturbances in the temporal lobes, have intense religious experiences. That extreme religiosity is common among such patients. Some believe that St. Paul was struck down by an epileptic fit when he was struck down on the road to Damascus. St. Teresa of Avila, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Marcel Proust, among others, were thought to have had temporal lobe epilepsy, which explained their focus on the spiritual. Thoughts or comments before I move on?
Yeah, it was just interesting with the thing of seeing the things that people have when they meditate or when they have that God, you said the God helmet type of thing?
Yeah.
That experience. Yeah, it's also similar to near death experiences. Some people swear on it. The people say, look, it's something I experienced. You can't go in. And I think the only the only thing less trustworthy than near death experience is lived experiences. But I guess near death experiences technically are lived experiences because you're alive. If you actually died, you would be dead, like technically. And this is also part of my objections with the whole Jesus Christ dying thing. He never actually died. Dying by definition is end. So and then like I guess you can also talk about maybe it's more towards like some Eastern traditions or this traditions that have the reincarnation. So they say like, okay, you didn't really die, or like Lazarus actually was dead and then he was brought back somehow. I don't know where his soul was. But anyway, so coming back to this thing, near-death experiences are just, there's never been a time when somebody was Christian and then went to the hospital and had some near-death experience in some kind of operation room thing, and then he said he was floating above, and then he saw Shiva, and then came back and was like, man, I was completely wrong. The Hindus are right. That's never happened.
No.
Every time that happens, when you come back, and your brain is trying to fill in that time that wasn't there, it fills it in with things that are culturally already familiar to you. Christians have Christian type of near-death experiences. Muslims have Muslim type of near-death experiences. Hindus have Hindu types of near-death experiences. That is the kind of reality that's in there. That's one of the rather telling things, and maybe somebody has found some kind of example of it. And maybe you can talk about the people like the DMT and these different kinds of things where they say you get to different realms and things like that. But that's one thing that to me is very suspect, at least, of some of these things that shows that this is a very a learned behavior that has its purpose, but this is learned and this is cultural and this is rather subjective to the person who's experiencing whatever it is that they're actually experiencing. Yeah.
Yeah, like there was no one who grew up in ancient Palestine who was like, oh, I had visions of the Roman gods despite being raised Jewish, or, like things like that, or like we say the Hindu versus the Christians. Like, I mean, have there been any Hindus who are like, I had a vision of Christ and I decided to convert? I mean, there may
Yeah.
be somebody, but as far as I know, that's not really that's
People don't
if
have
it's
near-death experiences and they've only spoken English and then come back knowing some other language that they've never known, seeing some kind of technology or some kind of architecture that they've never seen before. These are very telling things of why of what's happening in that point. And we already know how untrustworthy eyewitness testimonies actually
yeah,
are, of the things that you've actually experienced personally, even the things that you don't really stand to gain from. Just think about something in your past. There's all these experiences where like, that could be kind of wrong, but at the same point, some of the negative things that you think are true about your past could actually not be as negative. Some of the things that are as positive might not be. But again, this is back to the thing that we're talking about. Are people really about authenticity? Are we really about truth? And I don't think that's a key part to this genetic mecca, that bio mecca that we are, of just genetic reproducing the genes that we have. I don't think it really needs authenticity or truth in order to
no.
keep that going. There's some people who have been very mired to just falsehoods. We're talking about politicians like one Nancy Pelosi. She's very successful. She's passed on her genes. She's very wealthy. Her family's probably going to be set for the foreseeable future. A lot more set than most of the families of the people that are listening to this. And thank you for listening. But she's not somebody that's really invested in being authentic. I guess she's authentic to herself in a sense, but she's definitely not somebody invested in being truthful. But she's still successful in the whole genetic aspect of passing on her genes. So that's one thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, and Silas and I were discussing this before the video started. There's a good video, it should be public soon as subs only, with James Lindsay, where he talks about how the woke have a crisis of authenticity, and how there's a huge irony embedded in this, because they say you have to have these beliefs, these are authentic beliefs, but we have to use these beliefs for political activism. But politics is the least authentic thing there is, so the whole thing just makes no sense.
Yeah.
uh, uh,
And one last thing you had mentioned, they were talking about the sacred was between the ears, but there was a time when people believed in the gods and things, and we had less knowledge of how our bodies worked, and people really used to think thoughts actually were involved in the heart. It's for people like, it's just like, and some people still say this. It's not. You ask them about questions about why they believe in their gods, and as I mentioned, it's not anything of faith. It's when you have no evidence, this is the thing that you say. And often it will get to a point where they'll just be like, you just feel it. You just can feel him in your heart. If you open up your heart to him, you'll feel it. I'm like, nope, that's technically not where it is. It's over here. But yeah.
all right. Let's see. Moving on here. So, let's see. Lobes. So Andrew Newberg, an internist and radiologist at Thomas Jefferson University Hospital and Medical College, and an adjunct professor in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, pioneered neuroimaging studies of nuns praying, monks meditating, Pentecostals speaking in tongues, and people in various trances. His studies suggest that emotional states in which the individual, quote unquote, feels at one with the universe correspond to a high frontal lobe activity and low activity in the brain's left parietal lobe, an area responsible for integrating information that orients us in our environment. This tells us where our body ends and the world begins. If sensory input to that region of the brain is blocked by intense prayer, meditation, slow chanting, elegiac, I'm not sure, melodies, whispered ritual incantations, or other techniques, the brain may be prevented from distinguishing self and non-self, inner and outer world. Now, in fairness, these studies focus on people on the extreme. For example, when Pentecostals and charismatic Christians speak in tongues, glossolalia, it's called, the opposite happens. There is frontal lobe activity, which corresponds with a feeling of a loss of control, and high parietal activity, which corresponds with an intense of the self in relation to a god and attachment figure. So those are extreme cases. But now, in regards to the more typical non-religious people, the Cognitive and Neural Foundations of Religious Belief, a study published in the spring of 2009 from the National Institutes of Health, Dimitrios Kapogiannis, and 5 other researchers, gave us compelling evidence to support the byproduct theory of religion. Test subjects' brains were monitored using functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. I'm assuming everyone knows what that is. Researchers read various statements about religions about religion to the subjects, and they were asked to agree or disagree. No quote unquote God center was found in the brain, but the neuroimaging evidence did localize religious belief within the same brain networks that process capacities for theory of mind, intent, and emotion. Compare the results of both religious and non-religious test subjects. Comparing the results of them revealed no differences in the brain mechanisms used to assess these functions. Religiosity is not a separate function. It is integrated into the same brain networks used in social cognition. Religious belief is not unique. The study shows that religious beliefs, well-known ordinary social brain circuits and mind mechanisms, and that these mechanisms mediate that adaptive function that has been described. A recent study done by Sam Harris also used fMRI and tested both religious and non-religious people as they were presented with religious and non-religious propositions. The believer's brains showed activity in the part having to do with identity and how the individual sees and represents himself, regardless of the content presented to him. All right, thoughts or comments?
I don't know when I first heard this, but somebody was talking about how there are no Christian children, there are no Muslim children, there are no Jewish children. There's children of Christian parents, there's children of Jewish parents, there's children of Muslim parents, because some of these things are learned behaviors. And as mentioned before in this series and other times, and as was written here, there actually is an effect that actually is moving, that remains in your brain, that releases endorphins and hormones and things like this. There's a process that's actually involved in there. This thing would not have been something that has been part of human civilization for this long if it had no purpose, if it just was completely superfluous. Those things end up going off. That's why certain religions, in their limited scope of what they did for that particular group of people that came up with that belief system, once that group of people was no longer living, or that group of people was now living in a larger place. And there's a really cool series by Neil Gaiman, American Gods, and he has that's part of the premise of it. It's not a spoiler for the people who haven't actually watched the series or read the book. I suggest the book over the series, as I often do with these things, but there's audiobook as well you can get. But it's part of the premise is there's all these other gods that have been in history, and depending on how many people currently in the world believe in that particular god, that god gets more power. So some of the gods are showing kind of waning off and losing power because fewer and fewer people believe in that particular god. But because that construct of a god was answering or fitting or making people comfortable and feeling worth of participating in, the answers that they had for that thing are answered by other things or are no longer a practical thing. People used to be involved with, most of our gods used to be harvest gods for the longest time. Once it became it wasn't hunter gatherers, but after that was the farming. Once we were involved in farming, and then you had majority of the population was involved in regular farming. There was so many harvest type of gods and things like that. But now that's something that 2% of the population has. So we're not as tying into gods to harvesting in that kind of sense. Now they're more general for more specific things. But I was thinking, there's something that I thought when I was a kid. I moved to the United States of America when I was about 11, and I was coming from Kenya where we had tribes. We had tribes in the more traditional sense. Like my peoples are of the Luya tribe, and it has a language, it has a region that they still live. There's I think like about I want to say about 8 million of them who live in this general area. The Luyas and the Luos are kind of together. The Luo is, for those of you who might be somewhat familiar with, probably one of the few people you know from Kenya is Barack Obama's dad, who you're familiar with. He was a Luo, so he's one of the neighboring tribes to the tribe that we have in Western Kenya. But I got to the United States of America, and as I got older, I started to wonder, okay, this is a post-tribal society. And I was completely wrong about that. There were certain things I started noticing was in certain regions. Living in the D.C. area, I was a fan of the Washington Redskins. People didn't like the Cowboys, although a lot of people in the United States of America don't like the Cowboys. But that was their rival team. Then I went to school in the Ohio Valley area, in the West Virginia Panhandle area. And there's no team there for West Virginia, but it was close. It was like an hour away from Pittsburgh. Most of the people were Pittsburgh fans. And I started realizing that was something that was kind of tribally defining certain groups. You'd wear the Pittsburgh gear, and you'd see other Pittsburgh fans when you're somewhere else. If you were in that area with the Pittsburgh team won, there would actually be an appreciable uptick in people being happier during that weekend. Like bars would get more money. People would be at the bars. There were these kind of things that kind of define people. Then I was like, why is it everyone in West Virginia just happens to be, or where I'm at, happens to be a fan of the Steelers, but then people in D.C. were there, and you could start seeing these were things. And as you mentioned, here, the brain activity that happens when you're in this group of the people, when you're praying and you're preaching and you're singing and you're exalting and you're experiencing in this shared experience. We're social animals. And you go to any large spectator event and you'll feel that. Even if you don't know what's going on, you'll feel that kind of mob environment where that's part of why these protests and big movements are so enticing to certain people, because they want to be out there participating in something as a group. So some people as kids, their parents were fans of the Redskins. Some people's parents were fans of the Steelers. They took them to those games when they were still 5 or before even understanding what football was. But they saw their parents excited. They saw all these other people. They heard the cheering, and that activated something in their brain. And then when they get older, every time they probably see that subconsciously, it's still bringing those positive things back in them, that feeling in there. And that's a similar thing that happens with the faith and the religions. There's no kids who are Steelers fans. There are no kids who are Cowboys fans. There are no kids who are Redskins fans. But they're kids of Redskins fans. They're kids of Cowboys fans. They're kids of Steelers fans. And then chances are they grow up to be the fans of that team, or a smaller percentage of them grew up to be fans of the rival, in part because they watch the rival also more, because that's when they watch more of the games with them, and also there's some kind of rebelling from the people. And you see that also with other kinds of faiths and beliefs and religious type of social events and movements that we have as social animals. But yeah.
Well, yeah, and I mentioned this in an earlier video, but we should also emphasize here that these byproducts, don't see them as a defect, see them as part of, they made perfect sense in the context in which we evolved. I mean, we've talked about that's what this whole book is about, essentially. But like, understanding the stuff about the brain, don't see this as, oh, wow, something's wrong with me, that's why I'm being manipulated. No, it makes sense in the context in which our ancestors evolved, because this is how we made sense of the world. This is how we kept groups together, all this. So he made, and it's almost cliche, but it's kind of that everything happens for a reason thing. It's like these things may seem absurd to some people now, but looking at the context of our evolutionary history, you're like, okay, this makes sense. So don't see it as a defect, see it as something that we can learn from, and then, who knows, maybe we can overcome it, maybe we can adapt in some other way, but more information is generally better, as we always say.
Yeah, I prefer everything happening due to a reason. There's reasons behind things happening that we might know of, but I don't think there's a for. I think the for is more prescriptive versus going into like, okay, this happened due to these things. Things don't just happen out of nowhere. There are reasons certain things happen, but once they happened, what happens after is there's parts of what happens after that's up to you. How you take that thing happening is subjective. Like somebody spazzing out and punching somebody in the face, that happened because if you see somebody punched in the face, it didn't just happen. Somebody didn't all of a sudden just get hit. But it could be spasmodic attack. It could be, I hate this person, he slept with my wife. So the reason that happened, the reason a physical fist hits somebody's face, there's reasons of that happening. And then now what the person who got hit or the people around them do for it, there's not like, okay, this person got hit, and the reason of him getting hit was so I do this. No. It's once that has happened, what you do now is also based on other reasons. So it's not for a reason, but actions are based on reasons and due to reasons. It sounds pedantic, but this kind of, you're here with this conversation says this is us. This is the kind of stuff we do. Yeah.
Learn to live with us.
All right, so
this next section is really interesting.
Okay.
Mirror neurons. These exist in all our brains, probably in many different areas. They were accidentally discovered in macaque monkeys at the University of Parma in the 1980s and 90s. Subsequent research has shown them to be active in humans as well. This has been one of the most important findings in neuroscience. These neurons fire both when an animal performs an action and when the animal observes the same action being done by another animal. These neurons mirror the behavior of another as if the observer were performing the same action. That monkey see, monkey do. When you raise your right hand, nerve cells activate on the left side of your brain in the area that controls right arm movement. If you watch a person do this, the same neurons will light up even though your right arm remains still. If I stick a knife in my right hand, the pain perceiving areas of my left brain activate. If you see me do it, your brain reacts the same way. Think about that's why you cringe when you see somebody in pain or something, because you don't physically feel the pain, but your brain reacts the same way. You don't have to experience the pain to prove this. If you see someone stuck on a lemon, you may quote unquote taste the bitterness in your mouth and your mouth may water. Again, same thing. You don't actually, you may cringe, but you're not actually tasting lemon. Or try not to yawn when you see someone else do it. That's a whole contagious yawn, or contagious laughter is another example I think of. fundraisers take advantage of this. They can recite statistics about starving children, and the average person won't care. But if they show a pic of a starving child, a person will be far more likely to donate. The 2010 earthquake in Haiti saw something similar when imagery of what happened was broadcasted around the world. And that's where all these donations and things started pouring in, because people physically saw these people climbing out of wrecks, people wounded, people dying. So that resonated more than if you were just to hear some newscaster read off facts about the earthquake. So this year I thought is particularly brilliant. I wrote it in bold just for emphasis. We often hear that if it weren't for religion, we would be immoral and unethical. Mirror neurons resoundingly refute this. We literally feel others' pain, and that induces in us empathy, distress, and the urge to help. Our brains are ethical by design. Religions utilize this, and consciously or not, they utilize it in a way that can traumatize. Thoughts and comments on this before I continue?
Yeah. I guess this is perfunctory. These are perfunctory, but we mentioned this in several ones. I was raised predominantly Christian. Had some time when I think the final point was completely just like I really just realized I've tried and I really can't. I just can't. I just totally can't. And by now I should have posted the recording that I did about people who just say like I can't when they actually still can.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, I can't draw. I can't wait to draw a circle when I'm holding pencil. I can draw the circle right now. No, it was a situation where I realized I could not try anymore to really believe that. And I was like, okay, now I just, it's not anymore. Somebody was talking about one of somebody I knew in college was one of the most popular person in the college. Is one of the athletes who's very well liked and things like this. His parent was involved in back home was involved in the clergy and things like this. And he had certain things about his personal life that behaved in a certain way in dealing with females, and I was like, it's kind of weird. But then everything else, he didn't drink, he didn't curse, and I was like, yeah. But anyway, I asked him, I was like, okay, what do you think would happen if the Dalai Lama had like a completely excellent life, and then somebody else who was completely killed people, abused people, did all these bad things that you don't do, for example, but does it, and at the deathbed, he's like, okay, I accept Jesus. He's like, no, Dalai Lama would go to hell. He just answered that because to him that was like his belief system. It was like, it's kind of messed up. And then there's other aspects of it. For some people, they might find, like as I mentioned, some people truly might think this is their source of positive things in their life. But I also read the Bible, and I'm like, this guy drowned everyone on earth because like some people were bad, like the babies, like the animals, all these animals that we see that have all these drives where there's like, oh, look at all this. This poor little animal was drowning, and this person jumped in and saved it. Those videos make millions and millions of views. You look on YouTube, yeah. You look on like, every time there's some poor dog on my Facebook feed scrolling, I normally like stop. I'm like, oh, look at this dog. God did that to like all the animals. Just like drowned all these animals. Because what? Because Noah had to be on a boat? Like, come on now. Yeah. Some of these things to me were super traumatic. People talk about the big brother type of things with the state, which I completely understand that kind of authoritarian nature of states and dictators. But I don't see anything more authoritarian and dictatorly than a god. And I'll borrow this from Christopher Hitchens, also a well-known atheist, one of the greatest, I think, more recent atheist speakers on this topic, was talking about just the concept of heaven. We were talking about earlier when people have near-death experiences. When I was still trying to believe, it was like, when I would think of heaven, I'd be like, what kind of cars are going? Like, were they going to be cars? Do we need cars? Are you going to be able to walk everywhere? I mean, you're immortal, so even if a place was heaven is massive and it was like 500 miles away, if you have forever to live and you're not aging or something, could you just walk? And also, like, what age are you? Are you at the age that you died? What buildings are they? If somebody was believing in Jesus during Roman times and they're in heaven and you meet them, are they living in like Roman architecture, but then somehow they're looking at my current modern architecture, and do they view it as modern, or do they like, what even is that? Or have they been in heaven the whole time watching? But just the concept of heaven, when you get past that, it's eternal worship of a being. And that's how some of the most benign and nicest Christians will talk about this. I'm like, doing anything eternally is horrible, but imagine a being that wants you to worship them eternally. Like that is traumatizing. Imagine being like, I'm going to be able to exist forever, knowing that there's other people who just never knew about this guy named Jesus that are in hell, burning in the most horrific way possible, and you're able to think about that forever and be okay with that. Like some of these things were to me, those are things as a kid coming up already, I was kind of weighing with. And there's other people who have a lot more traumatic stories, people talking about coming out of cults and all these other things. But yeah, this has been used to damage people, and we can see what's being done with the current religions in the world that are based off of critical theory. We have different series of conversations in Marcuse and things like that, and critical theory in Marcuse and 1619 project. You can see what's being happening with like Black Lives Matter. People arguing that, oh, just let the kids fight. You know, it's knife fights. It's part of the kids fight with knives all the time. That's how much this has just rotted people's minds by having these beliefs in these religions and these. That's why I am currently very a-religious from trying to actually learn that stuff, from trying to be like, oh no, all religions are okay. We're all talking about the same spirit that we feel that's probably in this God helmet type of thing. Because when you do meditate, when I still do meditate, when I still do take time to think, I still have a feeling that there's something else out there that's outside me, because there's other humans out there. There's other things that I'm not even aware of out there. There's radio waves. There's all these other things. So I used to think that was just people talking about the same thing in different languages and different words and different terms. But I was wrong, because people are identifying that as a particular thing. And once you pretend or try to propose that you know what that thing is, then that thing can be judged on actual terms, on if that thing is positive or negative. And when you actually start looking at the things that people consider to be correct about this thing, I don't see how that's not traumatic for somebody who just has a general understanding of how reality works or things like that. Yeah.
It's interesting you say that about the animals. I really like that one of the guy who, I guess he had a puppy that got like an alligator was trying to eat, but it was like a small alligator, and he actually goes into the water and pulls it out, and then he pulls the puppy out of the alligator's mouth, and he has a cigar in his mouth the whole time while he's doing it. It's like,
was this in Florida? This sounds like a Florida story.
Yeah.
Definitely sounds like a Florida story.
And
but yeah,
the other funny thing was I don't know if you saw that thread. I think you might have liked it. The one about how COVID has become like a religion. I started drawing parallels before all that, and someone was comparing one of the things to circumcision, and a friend wrote, "It's a good thing circumcision was invented before selfies." I was like, "Oh, I can only imagine."
People still have that. Yeah, I don't know. I guess yeah. But yeah, again, that's another thing. Circumcision, that's been used. That's one of the few things where it's like the argument for circumcision can't really be made if you don't really have religious faith. That's pretty much the main thing that's keeping that form of child genital mutilation still alive, is primarily religious reasons. It's not, and that is a traumatic experience for any child or anyone to be put through. That's just one of the many that I think we can all think of that have been done by people who either believe in the religion that you believe in or another religion that have been able to use that belief to act in certain ways. And normally they've been traumatized to believe that if they don't go out and commit this horrific thing, we were recently just talking about how I was just recently watching something. It was a B1M, a really good channel, has different things in architecture. They say the primary channel, the primary location. The guy has a really unique voice. The primary location for architecture yeah, really good videos. But they're talking about the building of the One Trade Center, and I was just kind of thinking, like, they literally flew 2 planes into 2 towers. Like, that was such a modern attack, like, because it needed skyscrapers. It needed the ability for people to travel from one place that believe that the place they're going to is so evil, yet be able to sit in that place and learn how to fly planes, which is just a small, unique thing that was invented by thousands of years. Just the things I was thinking that came together for that attack to be able to happen. And the primary reason being, these people are evil, and if I do this, somehow an all-good God will give me nirvana. And then think about the effect of that on all the other people that have come from that the wars that were started with that, and the mutilations and the things that have continued. Why do we believe in gods? There's reasons, but I'm running out of good reasons to continue supporting that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Moving on here. All right, let's see here. It's been suggested that even after seeing a crucifix many times, we still feel some pain when seeing it. Some people have people have talked about the stigmata. It's believed that saints who claim to have had it likely experienced their unconscious minds perceiving the image so powerfully and traumatically that it became physically manifested. This likely happened in a trance-like state, knowingly or unknowingly. As this book is being read, neuroscientists are still at work researching how our brains generate, accept, and spread religious beliefs. This will likely build on all the work described. And he says that then you can count on it. That's actually the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10, yeah, few paragraphs, but chapter 10 is not super long. So, any thoughts on chapter 9 before we continue? Or
again, with the stigmata, the way people see things, again, this also comes to, if somebody wasn't familiar with what stigmata was, there was a time when people were less aware of what happened in the Bible. There's just less knowledge of biology and physics and things like that, where people used to think it was through the hands, and then they said they did some final tests, and they said scientifically, if you actually did it through the hands and somebody was hanging from the hands, they would actually, your hands are not load bearing enough, it would just rip through. Yeah. So then they said, okay, maybe it was the hands, and then it was like they were tied, the wrists were tied.
It's between there's two bones right here, so it goes
exactly.
between.
Is it the ulna and something? No, I think the ulna is a leg. But yeah, they said now it was between then. But stigmata, and then I think they've even gone back and seen like bones, and now they've done studies and excavations of, because people literally were being crucified for years. Yeah. When people walk around with a crucifix, they're literally walking around with a torture symbol and talking about, we're the good people. Let me spread the good word with you as I wear this torture symbol on my chest. Like, come on now, people. But that really happened. So they checked and saw how it was being done by the Romans and the people that were doing it at that time. And yes, it was through there. It was through the actual, because now that's load bearing, because the nail comes to the bone that's on there and it can actually carry someone's weight. But stigmata is normally on the actual palms, because that's how it was taught. That's how people were told. They told, like with the story of doubting Thomas, they didn't say Jesus showed him his wrist. They said he showed him his palm. I don't know if it's literally written as palm in the Bible or whatnot, but when doubting Thomas said they turned him away, but there's been, I think, stories at least told of it being through the palm. I remember as a kid being taught that, and then learning through actual people going into history and looking into science and seeing the difference of it. So that's part of how it informs certain things. People see certain things, talk about near-death experiences being informed of what they thought of before. But as you mentioned in the previous one, some of these things like, like Mother Mary's image isn't put on some toast. And people come from miles away, spend thousands of dollars. Really poor people who truly believe come and to look at this toast, to look at this thing, and you look at used to hear these stories a lot more when I was a kid, 20 years ago. I'm an old man now. But that used to happen back then a lot more. But some of these things I was looking, I was like, that's kind of small. That's like saying, I believe in Zeus, and Zeus controls the lightning and the thunder, and that's what he's about. Like, but then you're saying the only sign of it is not the thunderstorms, but he's like, every time you get like a static shock, you're like, that's the proof of Zeus. That's how minor the power discrepancy of what the God can do to show that the God exists versus what he actually does. So they're saying like God is omnipotent, but then he's going to spend time putting Mary on toast. Like, some of those things, I was like, why would he, why do you think the being that was doing that would do that? But I guess if you're omnipotent, then you creating an entire life form in Alpha Centauri takes as much energy as you creating energy and time in your experience being infinite to do toast in Caracas. I guess it's the same kind of energy expenditure when you're talking about infinite energy and infinite time. So I don't know with some of these things, but these are some of the thoughts that I had as a kid. I was not able to voice them as much as I have now. And the things where I still wonder, do people who do believe in these things still believe these things? And again, thanks to all my friends and listeners and people who do believe that still bear with me and willing to have these conversations with me. I'm very interested to hear from you. And yeah, just
well, what bothers me with sort of getting at what you're saying is with certain people, like I see in, among friends and people in my own family, is that like a lot of the stuff they say, because I've brought up similar points to this in conversation, and like they've never heard these arguments, which to me is bad because it says you've never engaged you never engaged material counter to your beliefs, put your beliefs to the test, weighed possible information, considered the possibility that it's been wrong. And some of these arguments, like about against intelligent design and things, they're pretty simple. I mean, why have most species on Earth died out? Why do we have wisdom teeth that cause pain and don't do anything? Why do we still have an appendix, even though it can lead to infections? Houdini died from that, for example. Why is so much of the universe uninhabitable? And that's just like a few, like, off the top of my head things. That's not like a really comprehensive analysis. But the fact that they've never been exposed to the idea suggests you've never read anything outside of your echo chamber to possibly challenge your beliefs, and you've never really put your own beliefs to the test and considered the possibility that they could be wrong and there's more out there. And I don't know. I mean, I'm the type of person, I guess I have this insatiable curiosity. I'm always asking questions, I'm always trying to learn. But I guess some people are just fine with staying in their own ignorance. I don't know.
Yeah. And part of why I was saying earlier that I suggest the book of American Gods over the TV show, even though I think the series was done pretty well from the content, at least from the things that I've seen that have done series to show, like even something like Lord of the Rings, which also came up in the conversation before, when we talked about authenticity of Lord of the Rings. I think Lord of the Rings is significant in teaching people about possible moral ways to live, good and evil, the hero's journey, like the way people can change, like the way like Boromir had his issues, like some heroes actually die early and things like that. Not the hero doesn't always live to the end. Even if you do succeed, even like Frodo did at the end, he still wasn't able to just go back to a happy life and had to go to
the Undying. They were called the Undying Lands.
Yes, something like that. It's such, like, the whole thing with Tolkien, it's again, that guy's amazing. Like he created Elvish, and then he created this entire universe for that language to actually have lived in. Like the Silmarillion to me is one of the really great things to just read. And it's not really too much story. It's more just like an appendix. It's like somebody was writing a history in that universe and that it was here. And so it's like an academic paper based in that universe about the history of the universe. It's really kind of cool how they break down those things. So actually reading, and I watched the first movie before I think I'd read some parts of The Hobbit as a kid. But then after watching the first movie, I went and read or listened to audiobooks of all. I don't know if I read or listened to audiobooks, but now I have a rather active imagination. So I was thinking of what these creatures would look like Shelob or the Balrog. And they did a pretty decent job of them, but in my mind, I think I had some cooler things that fit better to what I had in mind, but I still like what they did with them and what Peter Jackson did. But we're talking about here when a book is being read, neuroscience is still working and researching how our brains generate, accept, and they spread their religious beliefs. Now, you look at certain things with people reading certain books. Most people who've read the books dislike the actual films or shows based on them. People are like, that's not what Harry Potter is, and that's one of the really good ones. It would be like, they had so many objections to how Harry Potter was actually treated as a movie, even though it was really done rather faithfully if you actually look at the book content. But that's because as you're spending that time reading, as you're hearing somebody's story, you're doing that, you're developing a certain connection, a certain imagery, a certain certainty, belief of what these people look like, sound like, act like, what it means, the reasons those things happen. So when somebody comes and takes a book that's 500 pages that would have taken, if you're just reading it straight from an audiobook, would have taken 20 hours or so, and they smash it down into a film that's supposed to be 2 hours and has the visual aspects and the visual cues and all these kind of things that people have, there's going to be parts that are left out. So people will feel there's core parts to their belief of who these people are that are left out, that are changed in this different medium, and they have that objection to it. And that's when it comes to these things that we all accept to be fictional. People think Harry Potter on the screen is not the authentic Harry Potter. That's not really what happened in Harry Potter world. So now that's also applied when it comes to religions. Now the difference with religions, as I was mentioning at the start, is this is a belief about how the entire reality came to be. So when there's objections, if somebody puts a different version out of how reality is supposed to be, it's not just a film that you can decide to watch or not or have debates about. It's you're wrong about how everything came to be. Like you're not telling the story right. That's not how things came to be. So that's the strong effect of what actual religious belief does. And when it takes it to that different level where it's not just a fiction, but people take it to that different level where it's truth, where it's reality, where it's authentic existence. So that's something to be concerned about.
Sure. All right.
Yeah.
All right. That's all I have to say for chapter 9. So we'll just go into chapter 10 here.
So yeah, chapter 10, which is Lest Ye Be Judged, Educating Our Minds.
Darwin says, ignorance more frequently begets confidence than does knowledge. It is those who know little and those who know, not those who know much, who so positively assert that this or that problem will never be solved by science. So he was really foreshadowing the Dunning-Kruger effect here, I feel like. You know? So he talks a bit about the Scopes trial that was with William Jennings Bryan. It began in 1918, ended in 1925. What's actually crazy is that Bryan actually died 5 days after the trial ended from apoplexy. It's internal organ bleeding. So John Scopes was a substitute biology teacher convicted of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which forbade teaching in public schools, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible and to teach instead that man is descended from a lower order of animals. I see that in a southern accent right away. Yeah, so Scopes was actually defended by the ACLU. Scopes ultimately lost and had to pay a $100 fine. Remember, this is back then, so 100's a lot. It could be argued that although creationists won that court fight, they ultimately did lose the battle. The war still goes on. And what's interesting is that although, again, technically because of the laws, the creationists won that battle, but at the same time, everyone kind of mocked Bryan because I guess he cited this very fundamentalist Christian view of like creationism. I guess H.L. Mencken has some pretty like derisive criticisms of Bryan, as do other people. So it's one of those things where like, yeah, he won that, but longer term, it didn't ultimately win the war. The Butler Act remained in effect for almost another 40 years, and legal issues didn't come up again until 1967, when another teacher challenged the Butler Act on First Amendment grounds. Since the 1960s, there have been 19 major challenges to the teaching of evolution, 2 before the Supreme Court. So intelligent design replaced creationism. Recently as of late 2005, Judge John E. Jones III, a Pennsylvania federal district district court judge ruled against requiring the presentation of intelligent design as an alternative to Darwinian evolution in ninth grade science classes. While the judge struck down requiring intelligent design, he said explicitly that he believed there was no conflict between religion and science. Now, the author explains that this is tough because, again, it's politics versus philosophy. Like, we believe in pure principle that there is, they are at odds. I mean, I love that Nietzsche quote about how people try to say that Christianity and science relate, but he talks about how like science matches point by point more with Epicurus and is rejected by Christianity. And like there is something to that. But at the same time, politically, you can't get up in front of a crowd of Christians, many of whom might be the voting demographic, and say that. So they had to sort of find a way to sort of like, walk that tightrope of both crowds. As was mentioned earlier, Darwin had a tough time abandoning religion, but to his credit, he did only have a fraction of the information we have now. Of course, genes and everything weren't understood yet. They didn't understand quantum mechanics, obviously neuroscience. So some of these people who held on to religion for longer, further back, you can't be as hard on because it's like a lot less information was available. So the mental mechanisms that we have make us vulnerable to religion are deeply ingrained. Add to this indoctrination since a young age and societal pressures. As Jerry Coyne, an evolutionary biologist and former believer, said, in religion, faith is a virtue. In science, it is a vice. It has been argued, and I would agree, that it is easier to be a believer than not. Religions offer predetermined sets of rules, which, combined with our various mental mechanisms, eliminate the need to think about all these issues. The 2010 Pew poll on religion found that atheists and agnostics were more knowledgeable about the world's religions than the believers were. And honestly, I'm not surprised. I mean, we mentioned that several times about there's some Christians who have read everything in the Bible, can repeat it back from memory. Other people, you bring up the controversial stuff, they have no idea when it's like, well, it's pretty obvious. There's people who rush to defend Islam. Again, there's obviously controversial stuff in there if you've actually read the book. Someone like Aaron Ra, I'm really impressed because like he's an atheist, but I mean, he's read the Torah, the Quran, the Bible, the Mahabharata, and Hinduism, like all that stuff. And he can cite all these different stories from memory, which is really impressive for a guy who doesn't believe in any of it. This book has demonstrated the broad outlines of why we're drawn to religion using our understanding of psychology and cognitive and social neurosciences. As the science is better and better understood, a very precise and more detailed outline could emerge. And then the author ends with, quote, religion may offer comfort in a harsh world. It may foster community. It may incite conflict. In short, it may have its uses for good and for evil. But it was created by human beings, and this will be a better world if we cease confusing it with fact. The end.
Yeah. Like you were mentioning the Aaron Ra, like part of my first experience coming out of this stuff was going online and listening to a lot of things, and did listen to a lot of Alan Ross stuff. And he has a great channel where he goes into like, he has this entire series of going into actual evolution and breaking down things and like taking through years and things like that. And yeah, it's his profession. He's pretty much a full on act, like that's his job, going around different places speaking, and he makes the money off of that. So
People have called him an evangelical atheist. I was like, yeah.
Yeah. he's one of the most well studied and well versed in some of these things that I've seen on the online space. And with him, the Mahabharata, I think part of my was moving around as a child growing up, seeing the way people believed in the same God in different places, and then how different people believed in different gods and still behaved in the same kind of ways as the people who seemed to believe in this other God in a different place that believed in a different way than they do here. So those things like that, like coming to Kenya, I know one of the most popular things that I was watching, and this is probably going to be part of the cover image of this series, is going to be with Shiva with like multiple hands and things like this. But there was an Indian show with Mahabharata and Ramayana, these entire big soap operas, like people know like the Bollywood, people might be familiar with that, but Bollywood has been going on for decades. It's super old, but they have these massive, like, we see these kind of multi-season type of big shows. I guess they had Dallas and things like that in the past, but then now you see like the Game of Thrones type of things, or you see some of these bigger things. But it seems like even with the Indians, some cultures seem to be more open with depicting and displaying and characterizing their belief systems and their gods in this modern sense. Because yes, I think the Muslims of the known religions are the least likely to do them, because you're not even allowed to even visualize who Muhammad is. Mm. And I think with Jesus, with the control that there's been more smaller things, but I think with the bigger control that the religious in general, Christian right had in the past, they were a little more low. Don't say the Lord's name in vain. That was something that was still taught as I was a kid. So having a TV show with Jesus, I remember watching the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston and things like that. But it was a little more tested with depicting actual Jesus in cinema. Now that's been done more, like The Passion of Christ, an amazing film in my opinion from Mel Gibson. Of course, my opinion is opinions that I'm giving on this talk. But what I was talking about was this: they've had these grand things. So Ramayana and Mahabharata is like a soap opera. It's this massive multi-season thing, and that was being shown here in one of the few channels that we had, because there's a majority of the 75,000 or so to a million people of Indian descent that are now Kenyan, that are multi-generation Kenyan, live in Nairobi. It's like Nairobi is like 75% of them, like 20% live in Kisumu, which is the second big city, and then 5% of them live in like Mombasa and the coast area. Those other areas is completely fully tribal, like I was mentioning, my Luo tribe. You go to Luo land, it's like 95% Luyas. Like there's some Luos in there, and then there's like a few percentage of other people and things like that. So that I remember watching that and not really understanding too much of, oh, this is an entire different belief system in Hinduism. Then in high school, I went to a rather good high school. It was one of the top high schools, public high schools in the United States of America. They had a comparative religion class. Internet was starting to come around, so it was still going on. I wasn't that, at that point, I was kind of coming out more religion. I was going to a Presbyterian church, but I was getting old enough to be like, Mom, Dad, I'm not coming to church with you Sunday. But anyway, then after college is when I got more into it. But looking at these different kind of belief systems really, really does enrich somebody. And very few people have looked into their own belief system, let alone the actual other belief system. So to find people, and normally you find the more somebody has looked into it, actually the less they actually believe the stuff. And then again, this goes back to the authenticity thing. Just because somebody says they believe something, does that mean they really believe that? Some people completely understand that it is beneficial for them to do something, especially we're talking about movies, we're talking about acting. Just because somebody's acting as Hanuman and saying on the show, "I am Hanuman. I'm here to save you from." No, Shiva was a good person. Who was the bad? I forget the name of the bad god. Kali. I think it was Kali. I'm here to save you from Kali.
Yeah, I'm not familiar.
Those two people don't literally believe they're Hanuman and Kali. The people in the show who are like, "Oh my God, Hanuman is here. Praise Hanuman." They don't literally believe that, but they understand they're acting and they're getting paid to do that. But in regular life as well, people do understand that if I live in this society, if I move to this small city, I have a job here, I can go to church and just sit there and spend my time there and be part of the society. Or I can just stand there and be like, this is wrong. I can just stand there in front of the church every day and be like, you guys, this is false, this is false, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. What's the benefit of doing the two? And again, I'll finish off with coming through this period, I think Aaron Ra has talked about this. If you're familiar with Aaron Ra and familiar with other people in the atheist space online, there was an atheist experience, which is like Seth Roberts, who's another well done speaker. It's Seth something. I think Roberts is wrong. I'm forgetting his
Hmm.
actual name.
I'm not sure off the
But
top. Maybe if I saw it.
he gets people to call in, and he often has people who call in who are preachers. You say like, I've invested in this. My wife believes, says she believes. My kids are part of it. I'm part of this community. I have a flock of 200 people that come to me and answer me, but I don't believe anymore. And what do those people do at those points? They keep preaching the stuff because they're in there, they're committed, and they can see in general they feel there's a lot more positive coming out of there. And these are the places that we catch ourselves in, where it's like, do we literally do everything we believe? And I don't think that's necessarily the case, because like seeing is believing, and then the believing actually leads to the actual actions of the things that you actually do. Like, you believe this is the way that it is, and then you act based on that belief. You believe this is not Harry Potter, and then you boycott the movie because this is this is not your belief. So these are the kind of things that kind of these are the kind of questions to ask, like, why do we believe this? Why do you believe this? And it's been very interesting to see the reasons of why we have certain beliefs, and do those things still exist? Do those beliefs still fit the needs and reasons that you actually adopted them to begin with, or that we created them? That's a good thing to think of.
Yeah, and the point about mirror neurons was really interesting. I had no idea about this until I read this book, but I thought about it, it makes sense now, because that's why somebody sees someone in pain, they cringe right away, because there's
Yeah,
something in us that we don't want to see another person suffer. Now we can talk about, okay, there are sociopaths who feel nothing, but like you're talking what, like 5% of the population,
yeah,
or unfortunately many of them go into politics, lucky us. But the average person, the average person on the street, they see somebody in pain, they'll feel something in themselves. Like, again, they don't physically feel the pain, but that mirror neurons thing makes sense, because it's like, in the past you had to be able to see someone, you had to see a tribe member in need, and it gives you the impetus to help them. You feel something that makes you want to help them. And then the reverse is true too. If you're wounded, they see that and they're like, okay, I can't leave this person, and then they would help you. If we didn't have that instinct, we would have died out. It'll be, oh well, I'll just leave him behind to get eaten by a lion or something. Oh.
yeah. And it's also the basic genetic thing, because in the past, like we mentioned in the previous ones, you only used to deal with like 100 or so people, and then most of those people you saw had some genes in you, and we are
Yeah.
vehicles for our genes to reproduce. So it made sense for your genes to have some kind of signal in your home mecha machine to have some kind of affinity, because chances of you seeing somebody injured, that was chances are that persons would have some genetics that share with you. So your genes were kind of had that aspect. And if you're familiar with EvoCycle, for me, I had been familiar with mirror neurons for some time, because mirror neurons for some time, from being familiar with some of the EvoCycle stuff. Like, in the two books that I've discussed, did bring those things up. They touch on them a bit, and it's an interesting space to be in. Like, in the whole thing with like the science and the Christianity, I just went to because it's something that I was familiar with from the past. In high school, I remember the first time I came across some Christian scientists. There were some Christian
Mm.
scientists in our school that ostensibly did not use medicine, because as you were mentioning that, and the difference between science and Christianity, and I've said before that in general, I seem to get along pretty well with your average American Christian, because when it comes down to the practical sense, they're not going to be like, hey, did you sleep with your wife before you married her? Oh, you did? We got to take her out to the gate of the town and stone her. That's in the Bible, but they choose not
Yeah.
to believe that stuff and follow that stuff. So in general, the average Western Christian is modernized Christian is somebody who's in general a decent person, because human beings are in general decent people despite their beliefs. Now, but the Christian scientists I heard of were like, they did use medicine. That was a specific thing that I supposedly heard that they don't go to, because I was thinking,
Yeah.
yeah, some people might say they believe, but instead of just praying, they'll pray and then go get an MRI. They won't just pray and say everything's okay. So that's pretty much the ostensible difference with your average atheist and Christian person in the modern world. But the Christian Scientists, I went to their website. It's christianscience.com. So this is a Believe in Teachings. I just want to read this short part. You can go find it, christianscience.com, if you want to read more. But I just wanted to see if that was in there. And they said, like, Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, was asked if Christian Scientists had a religious creed. She answered, they have not. If by that term it's meant doctrinal beliefs, science and health were key to scriptures, and it's page, I guess, in the book that she had, then she did provide a few tenets or key points that briefly summarize the teachings of Christian Science. And it's 6 points, so just bear with me here. Um, The adherents of truth, we take inspired word from the Bible as our sufficient guide to eternal life. We acknowledge and adore the supreme and infinite God. We acknowledge his Son, one Christ, and the Holy Ghost, and the divine comforter, and man in God's image and likeness. Number three, we acknowledge God's forgiveness of sin in the destruction of sin, and the spiritual understanding that casts out evil as unreal. But the belief in sin is punished so long. But the belief in sin is punished so long as the belief lasts. Seems kind of interesting there. We acknowledge Jesus' atonement as the evidence of divine, efficacious love, unfolding man's unity with God through Christ Jesus and the way shower. And we acknowledge that man is saved through Christ, through life, through truth, life, and love, as demonstrated by the Galilean prophet in healing the sick and overcoming sin and death. We acknowledge that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and his resurrection serve to uplift faith, to understand eternal life, even the allness of soul, spirit, and nothingness of matter. That's an interesting phrase there. And we solemnly promise to watch and pray for the mind to be in us, which was also in Christ Jesus, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us, and be merciful, just, and pure. Now, those are the tenets of Christian Science. There's nothing in there mentioned about not going to a doctor, not using actual science, and it's all called Christian Science. So that was why I was wondering, why would somebody who's a Christian Scientist specifically not want to partake in medical things, which is part of scientific knowledge? But if I say this, the average Christian, what would the average Christian really object to? Maybe the nothingness of matter. Maybe the whole part with the belief in sin, like punishment believes only as long as you believe in sin, because some Christians will say sin exists whether you believe in it or not. So they say, I'll pray for you if you don't believe in Jesus, Jesus believes in you type of thing. So most of these things, what really puts Christian scientists, this is the creator, this is the person, the founder of Christian Science has said this. So what Christians does this not really apply to? Like what belief system, let alone if you change it to Allah, if you change it to Yahweh, or is it Yahweh? I forget. Yeah, to
Yahweh is Hebrew, yeah.
Yeah, if you change it to other kind of belief systems, wherever the Mormons use Jehovah, or they just say God. I don't know, but
They just say God. They just say
okay.
God, but they cite Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon now.
Okay, yeah. So with this belief kind of things, now what if you're generally what in here besides you saying you believe in these things would change you from being an atheist to live like your typical? Nothing in here says by this you should act this way. Does it say these particular things? Maybe the belief in sin. I don't know. So that's kind of a question, as I'm saying, like the way people say they believe certain things versus how they actually act. I am more interested in how they act, but I completely understand that the beliefs in something will eventually affect how they act, because I'm pretty sure those people that I was familiar with stated that their belief as Christian scientists was they couldn't go and use certain medicine. Maybe that comes to the nothingness of matter or something, or maybe they said some of these things mess up with their soul and the spirit. I don't know what was the basis for that. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know as much about that belief. I found that Nietzsche quote that I was referring to, though. So he wrote this on late 19th century. I'm trying to think if this was All Too Human. Human, All Too Human was written 1877. This might have been it. I'm not sure. Or maybe Will to Power. That would have been towards the end. Here's what he said. Even today, many educated people think that the victory of Christianity over Greek philosophy is a proof of the superior truth of the former, although in this case it was only the coarser and more violent that conquered the spiritual and delicate. So far as spiritual truth is concerned, it is enough to observe that the awakening sciences have allied themselves point by point with the philosophy of Epicurus, but point by point been rejected by Christianity. I thought that was interesting. Yeah, he said that
And
late 19th century.
and that's part of why Islam has had as big of a recent growth. It's a younger faith. It's the youngest of the Abrahamic trilogy of reality of trying to understand reality. It's also a lot. It's more in its very active phase, very very soldierly phase. It's still more towards the part of Jesus saying he comes to he's a sword. You know, he's I forget the actual phrase, but there's a part of Jesus where he's like, turn the other cheek. There's that part, give unto Caesar. There's those parts. There's also the parts where he's like, I'm the sword. I'm not here for like peace. I'm here. There's a part of throwing the Pharisees out of the temple, the people who are buying stuff out of the temple. There's also that part. Jesus is a lover and a fighter. He's a bit of both. There's still more tied to the whole like wrathful God type things, and there's a transition in that. There's a different way that people act once they have power in different positions. And with some of these kind of videos we do, like I do like cuts and snippets from it, and there's a part that I'm listening on the third part that we're having the essay for liberation. There's a part in there where we're talking about how different people might say something when they don't have power. Like pacifism is something that, if you're weak, being a pacifist, supporting pacifism isn't something virtuous. Of course, if you're weak, you're going to want as few fights as possible. But if you're strong, you're in power, and then you're at the point where you're like, okay, I'm still a pacifist. That's a different kind of thing. Now try to see where, when people have certain beliefs that are about kumbaya, about peace and love and unity, what happens when those people with those belief systems are given state power? And that's when things get really dicey. And we're seeing that right now in a lesser level, less bloody and vicious as it's been in the past. But it's as true as what we're seeing right now with the current belief systems of these progressivisms and the people who are the belief systems. Oh, we're just going to teach these few people. Just let us teach our people this. Then how about you guys also allow us to teach this in your class? Okay, how about you let us teach this completely and have an entire course? Okay, let's have an entire school where everybody has to come to this school before you can actually work in your job, and you have to learn this stuff from us before you go in there. Now we're going to have the government mandate, if you don't do these things, you're actually not going to be able to actually even work with the government. You're not going to have any actual job. That's a typical thing that we see in religions and people do once they get in power. It's a very common thing, because that personal belief gets to be something where you believe it. Let us believe it together with other people. Okay, believe it together with other people. Then once you have other people together, you get enough power and you start imposing it on other people. And one of the things that made me kind of think about this as well, you're mentioning with the different ways of the Scopes trial about the things being taught in class, that's something that was happening with the religious right. They're saying, we're going to get this. And that went from people just 7 days, and then people started realizing, do you mean literal 7 days? And people are like, okay, we can't really keep mentioning 7 days because people are going to notice that's kind of BS. People have a better understanding of what time is. It's going to be like the Gregorian calendar 7 days or like Mayan calendar 7 days. It's like, they're going to be like, okay, we understand it wasn't literally 7 days, it's different times. So they moved it to say it's like divine creation. Okay, divine. Then it's like, is that really divine? There's certain things in there that we understand about how things work that don't really make sense. Then it's kind of like, okay, then it's creationism. It's just about creationism, about the way things are created. Then that term doesn't really work. Okay, intelligent design. You look at the change of that thing. It's still the same thing they're talking about, and you see that with progressives. They're talking about one thing, but they keep changing the name of it, of the definition of it, so they can find it to be more palatable and sneak it in a different kind of way. And that's a common thing that you see people do, and that's something that's been done in the past, something that we've done today, and something that will continue to be done tomorrow. And I wish we can at least notice it and take note of it. And a difference is that we can have conversations like this about it, whereas even in the past, and this is the thing, I think in the past, if we had the ability to have conversations like this, some of those belief systems wouldn't have been able to be as strong as they were. And that's why I'm thinking, even though there are some very real issues with the current belief systems that are getting power in society due to the fact of us having conversations like this, of people like you coming and listening to the things that we're having, I think that spells a better world for all of us involved, whether you believe in gods or not. It's just it's the best time ever to believe in gods in the history of believing in gods, in my opinion, believe or not believe, but yeah.
Well, James Lindsay talked too about in the authenticity video about how his goal is to try and get more people to be authentic, because if you are more authentic, you're not susceptible to a lot of these beliefs, because you don't care if people don't like you. You don't care. You're not going in each interactions that thinking, oh no, if I say these things, people may call me racist and I'm really worried. You know, you don't care about stuff like that. So by getting people to become more authentic, these people have less and less power. Like he and I are not persuaded by the woke because we've studied their philosophy pretty in depth. You know, I'm not going to say I'm an expert, but I've delved into it enough to know. And because we're authentic and we don't mind, we will speak our minds, and we don't care if we get flack for it. But a lot of these people are cowards and they're scared of, oh no, if we say something we'll get criticized. And it's like, I think ultimately it has to become about strengthening people, but people also have to want to do it for themselves, and you know, not everyone's willing to do that, sadly.
Yeah. I think that's it for me.
That's all I have. Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I guess just to finish off, thank you all for listening. Do you believe in gods personally? Did you learn anything from this series? Do you think there were things that were missed out? Do you think that we've done in the conversation that are not quite right? By the time you listen to this, the other parts would be posted. There'll also be clips. So I implore you, I ask you if there's parts that you found interesting, please at least share the actual links. I'll put this also in a playlist together. It'll be on the website, on Rantathon, and also on this YouTube page or wherever else you listen to this. Some other places don't have the playlist ability yet, but I will be having one location where you can get all this information. There'll also be clips, shorter clips that you can share and post with other people. And this is part of what we've talked about. Some of these things, why do we talk about these things? And we've both talked about how before this, like, there's going to be some people who know us, who might hear this, who might dislike it and bring it up. But I think that we've self-selected groups of the people who are of faith, who believe in God's, seem to be more at least willing enough to discuss certain topics. And if they're not willing to discuss it and they take it in the wrong way, then that's something that happens.
I'll get a
But
few messages saying, "Well, I'll pray for your soul" or something
yeah,
like that.
that could happen in some of the things. But you personally might have certain questions, or you might have certain belief systems. There's a lot of other people out there. Aaron Ra is one person we mentioned, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins. There's a bunch of other people out there.
Yeah.
A lot of these people I don't agree with on other political things, but certain topics I agree on.
Aaron Ra.
Yeah, just like
especially he identifies as a feminist and stuff, and I'm just like, no, dude.
Like with Matt Dillon, he's very politically left. But just like the similar in some situations where I think I've looked more into certain things than other people have, but there's some people who believe in Allah, people who believe in Jehovah, people who believe in Yahweh, who I'm very close with, and we agree with on other things. So you don't have to completely agree with somebody. Just authentically be yourself. And I think part of that is having these conversations, talking about these things. Sometimes you might have a question with somebody, instead of, if there's something we voiced, maybe check one of the clips and you can share it with somebody and see how somebody reacts to it. That's part of what my process was, and I think that's part of why I really take a lot of enjoyment making this content, because a lot of other people took their time to make that content, and I went and watched it and I shared that with other people, and that led me to meet other people and get other communities. And yeah, that's just part of what I am excited about. Very many reasons I think gods came to be have been things that were actually solved and answered by technology and science and knowledge and information, rationality and logic and things like that, have built a better reality versus just having that kind of faith in things. Now, that's something that I'm willing to argue with. Excited and open to see you comment whatever you want in whatever comment section that's available and wherever you actually listen to this content. But I think that's it for me. What else do you have to say, Stephen?
Just and like he says, I mean, they're still researching this. I mean, who knows? Maybe a few years from now, this stuff may be even better understood. There may be a very clear outline. And lately, that's been something I've been trying to think of, how to explain certain things to people. Like, for example, I got a few people to read Rothbard's Marx as a religious eschatologist, but I've been trying to think of how to, like, put those arguments into a few sentences so, like, I can make the point across, but in a concise way. And I think with things like this, we're getting to that point too, where like he says, there could be some outline that just says this chemical does this chemical does this is why the rituals do this brain is part of the brain does this, and it's like, okay, you can understand it in a quick time. And I think as things develop, we'll find better ways to do that, and it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and we're also recording this at the end of April, and I think next month or something, the United States of America is declassifying a whole bunch of stuff with UFOs. So by the time you listen to this, maybe some aliens would have landed from Alpha Centauri, X Silpha, whatever, Prime Sigma, whatever, and be like, no, you guys are completely wrong. We actually talked to God, and these things that you feel in your mind are actually like effects of God. And here's a video of him. You can live chat with him. Like, now we found you. Like, he sent us here to like look, this is what's going on. And they could be a completely proven God. As we've mentioned before, I am not against the idea of a possibility of there being a God being. The God being either exists or it doesn't exist. Those are the two possibilities. I just think that all that I've heard that humans have said were the God, identifying this God being, don't really seem to mesh, and I don't have enough belief in that being accurate to any being that has actually been shown to exist. Not that they can't be one, I'm just saying no human has provided any information that seems to be convincing enough for me to think that's the one or ones that actually does exist.
Sure. Yeah, I agree.
Okay. So last thing, next series shall be self-reliance. We'll figure out with Stephen how to get that one going. I think we might have an extra friend come in on that one. We'll figure out, but that one will be self-reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you want to actually get started on that, it's about an hour and a half it's on public domain, so it's hour and a half on YouTube. You can find it or other places. I think I'll have posted all of this before I post any of that one, but that one we're going to be picking. We're all going to read. Everybody involved in the conversation will have read the parts and then taken out some certain sections, and then we'll put those sections together. And chances are, Stephen and I will pick some of the similar sections that we want to discuss. And then I think the format for that will be we get in the conversation. I'll play an actual clip of the section that we're going to be discussing because the guy who read it had in that whole British voice. It's really fitting to the content that's actually in. So that, and then we'll break down the content and we'll go along with that. So that'll be the next series, and then we're still pushing back. The human action one is still in the back burner. It's still in the plans. But yeah, that's it. That's it for me. Stephen, stay on after you say bye. But yeah.
Thank you all for listening. I hope you learned something. And if you have any feedback, I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.